Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Answers. Tonight, we're drifting into one of the most profound mysteries that has ever haunted the human mind. A question so fundamental that it touches every moment of your existence, every choice you believe you've ever made, every decision that has shaped the person you are right now. Do we have free will? Or is the sense of control we feel over our lives nothing more than an elaborate illusion? A comforting story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we can do. As you settle into this journey with me, I invite you to let your body relax, to allow your mind to open gently to the strange and beautiful territory we're about to explore together. If you enjoy these quiet explorations into the deepest questions of existence, I'd be grateful if you'd consider liking this video or subscribing to the channel. It helps others find their way to these peaceful contemplations, one curious mind at a time. But for now, all you need to do is rest, breathe, and wonder. The question of free will sits at the very center of what it means to be human. Every morning, when you wake up and decide whether to get out of bed or stay beneath the warm covers for a few more minutes, you feel like you're making a choice. When you deliberate over what to have for breakfast, when you choose your words in a conversation, when you decide to forgive someone or hold on to anger, when you commit to a new path in life or stay with the familiar, you experience yourself as the author of these decisions. The feeling of agency, of being in control, is so deeply woven into the fabric of human experience that to question it seems almost absurd. Yet, philosophers have been questioning it for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks wrestled with this paradox. If the gods had already determined the course of events, could humans truly be free? The Stoics believed in a kind of cosmic determinism, where everything unfolded according to a rational plan, yet they also emphasized human virtue and choice. Medieval theologians struggled to reconcile divine omniscience with human freedom. If God knows everything that will happen, including all your future choices, are those choices truly free? Or are you simply following a script written before you were born? In more recent centuries, as science began to reveal the mechanical workings of nature, the question took on new urgency. If the universe operates like a vast machine, with every event caused by previous events in an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of time, where is there room for genuine choice? Where is the space for a decision that isn't simply the inevitable result of prior causes? This isn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle. The answer matters deeply. Our entire system of morality, justice, and human relationships rests on assumptions about choice and responsibility. We praise people for their good deeds and blame them for their harmful actions. We feel pride when we accomplish something difficult and regret when we fail. We build societies on the idea that people can choose to follow or break the rules, and that they deserve reward or punishment accordingly. If free will is an illusion, if we're all just dominoes falling in a predetermined pattern, what happens to all of that? The question also touches something profound in how we understand ourselves. The experience of deliberating, weighing options, and making a choice feels like the essence of consciousness itself. To be aware is to feel like there's a you inside, making decisions, steering the ship. If that feeling is false, if consciousness is just along for the ride while unconscious processes do all the real work, What does that mean for the nature of the self? So, as we begin this exploration, I want you to notice that feeling of agency you carry with you constantly. That sense that you're in control, that you're choosing to listen to these words, choosing when to let your attention drift or when to pull it back. Hold that feeling gently as we examine it together, because by the end of this journey, you might see it differently. You might understand it more deeply. Or you might find yourself even more confused, standing in awe before a mystery that refuses to give up its secrets easily. Let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts soften. And let's begin to pull apart the threads of this beautiful, troubling question. The feeling of freedom. Before we dive into laboratories and philosophical arguments, I want you to spend a moment simply noticing what choice feels like. Right now, you could decide to close your eyes or keep them open. You could shift your position or stay still. You could think about something else entirely, or continue following these words. Whatever you do in the next moment will feel like it emerges from you, from some central place of decision-making that you call I. This phenomenology of choice, this felt experience of deliberation and decision, is remarkably consistent across human beings. When you face a decision, there's often a sense of considering different possibilities. Your mind might simulate different outcomes. You might imagine yourself taking one path, then another, feeling into what each option would be like. There's a sensation of weighing, of evaluating, of one option gradually gaining strength until it tips over into action. And then there's the moment of commitment, where possibility crystallizes into actuality, where the future becomes the present through what feels like an act of will. Think about a meaningful choice you've made recently. Maybe you decided to reach out to an old friend you'd lost touch with. Maybe you committed to learning something new. Maybe you chose to forgive someone who hurt you, or to set a boundary with someone who was draining your energy. When you remember that moment of decision, you probably remember it as a moment where you were genuinely in control. You surveyed the landscape of possibilities. You considered the reasons for and against, and then you chose. You did it, not your circumstances, not blind chance, not some mechanical process in your neurons. You. The experience of making that choice probably involved multiple layers. First, there was the recognition that a choice needed to be made. Something in your life wasn't working, or an opportunity presented itself, or circumstances shifted in a way that demanded a response. This recognition itself feels like a moment of awareness, of consciousness catching sight of a fork in the road ahead. Then came the period of consideration. You might have spent days or weeks turning the question over in your mind. In quiet moments, you found yourself imagining one possibility, then another. You might have talked it through with trusted friends or family members, hearing their perspectives and weighing them against your own instincts. You might have made lists of pros and cons, trying to organize your thinking into something more systematic. Or perhaps the deliberation was less explicit, more of a background process where your mind kept returning to the question, examining it from different angles, letting various emotions and intuitions bubble up. During this phase, you probably experienced uncertainty. The future hung in the balance, genuinely open to multiple possibilities. You could feel the weight of the decision, the sense that what you chose would matter, would shape the trajectory of your life in meaningful ways. This uncertainty is itself a kind of evidence for free will, or at least it feels that way. If everything were predetermined, if your brain had already decided what you would do, why would you experience this genuine not knowing, this sense of multiple possibilities that could go either way? Then there was the moment of resolution. Perhaps it came suddenly. A shift where one option that had been competing with others suddenly felt right, felt like the answer. Or perhaps it accumulated gradually, with one possibility slowly gaining strength until it tipped over into certainty. But in either case, there was a moment where the deliberation ended and the decision crystallized. This is when you said to yourself, "Yes, this is what I'm going to do." And that declaration felt like it came from you, from your deepest sense of who you are and what you value. Finally came the action itself, the follow-through. You reached for your phone and composed a message to your old friend. You signed up for the class or ordered the book. You had the difficult conversation where you expressed your forgiveness or set your boundary. And as you took these actions, you experienced them as flowing from your decision, as expressions of your will. You were the author of these moments, the one making things happen rather than merely observing them happen. Or consider more mundane moments. You're standing in front of your closet, deciding what to wear. Options present themselves. This shirt or that one? These pants or those? The weather might influence your choice. Your plans for the day might matter, but ultimately it feels like you're selecting from a menu of real alternatives. The choice could genuinely go either way. And when you finally put something on, you selected it. You exercised your will. But notice the layers even in this simple choice. Your eyes scan across the available clothes. Some immediately catch your attention, while others recede into the background. Already, before any conscious decision, your brain is filtering, prioritizing, directing your attention based on factors you're not fully aware of. What you wore recently, what's clean, what feels comfortable, what matches the weather, what fits your mood, what you associate with different social contexts. All of this is happening beneath awareness, shaping which options even register as possibilities. Then, among the options that rise into conscious consideration, you might feel preferences emerging. This shirt feels more appealing somehow. That combination of colors doesn't quite work. These pants would be comfortable for what you're doing today. Some of these preferences you could articulate reasons for. Others are more like gut feelings, intuitive responses that arise without clear justification. And then, often without much drama, you reach for one particular outfit and put it on. The decision is made, though you might be hard-pressed to explain exactly when or how it happened. Even in the tiniest micro-choices throughout your day, this feeling persists. You decide to scratch an itch, to take a sip of water, to shift your gaze from one thing to another. These aren't big, dramatic decisions, but they all carry that same subtle quality of originating from a central you, a conscious agent who is navigating through the world and making moment-by-moment choices about how to act. Actually, let's linger on one of these micro moments. You feel an itch on your arm. For a moment, you're aware of it, but not acting on it. Then your hand moves to scratch. Did you decide to scratch, or did your hand just move? If you pay close attention to moments like this, you might notice something interesting. Sometimes there's a clear sense of deciding, of directing your hand to move. Other times, the movement just happens, and your awareness of it comes simultaneously with or even slightly after the action. The boundary between deliberate choice and automatic response can be surprisingly fuzzy. This variability in the experience of agency is itself worth noting. Sometimes you feel clearly in control, consciously directing your actions. Other times you are more on autopilot, actions flowing without much conscious input. And there's a full spectrum in between. This suggests that choice isn't a single uniform phenomenon, but rather a family of related processes that can involve consciousness to greater or lesser degrees. Consider conversations. Words flow from your mouth, often without any conscious deliberation about each specific word. You know what you want to express, and somehow your brain translates that intention into a stream of language. But did you choose each word? Did you consciously decide on the syntax of each sentence? Probably not. Yet, the overall content, the ideas you're communicating, those feel like your choices. You're steering the conversation, even if many of the micro decisions about how to express each thought are happening automatically. Or think about skilled activities like playing music, or driving, or typing. When you're proficient at something, your actions flow smoothly without much conscious oversight. Your fingers find the right keys or notes. Your hands and feet coordinate the complex dance of operating a vehicle. Consciousness is there, but it's more like a gentle guide or monitor than a micromanager. Most of the real work is happening in unconscious processing, yet the activity still feels like something you're doing, something you have control over. This experience is so fundamental, so immediate, that for most of human history it wasn't even seriously questioned. Of course, we have free will. We feel it directly, constantly. To deny it seems like denying the evidence of our own experience, like claiming that the sky isn't blue or that pain doesn't hurt. How could something we experience so intimately and continuously be false? The philosopher René Descartes famously argued that even if he doubted everything, he couldn't doubt that he was thinking, and therefore that he existed. I think, therefore I am, became the foundational certainty from which he tried to rebuild all knowledge. In a similar way, the experience of choosing, of being an agent who makes decisions, feels like one of the most indubitable features of conscious experience. How could you doubt that you are making choices when the very act of doubting is itself a choice? Yet, philosophers have been raising challenges to this intuitive picture for a very long time. The ancient Greek philosopher Democritus argued that everything in the universe, including human behavior, is the result of atoms moving according to physical laws. Free will, in his view, was an illusion. The Stoics, while they valued virtue and moral development, also believed that everything unfolds according to a rational cosmic order, a logos that governs all events. Human freedom, for them, consisted in aligning one's will with this inevitable unfolding rather than in having genuine alternative possibilities. In the modern era, the philosopher Baruch Spinoza argued that free will is a confused notion arising from our ignorance of the true causes of our actions. We feel free, he said, because we're aware of our desires but unaware of what causes those desires. It's like a stone rolling down a hill, imagining that it's choosing to roll, being conscious of its motion, but ignorant of the forces propelling it. These philosophical challenges suggest that the intuitive evidence of free will might not be as decisive as it initially seems. Perhaps we should be suspicious of trusting our experience without further investigation. After all, our experience can mislead us in all sorts of ways. But here's where things get interesting. Because the history of science is full of examples where direct experience turned out to be misleading. It feels like the Earth is standing still and the sun is moving across the sky, but we know now that's backwards. It feels like solid objects are continuous and substantial, but quantum physics reveals them as mostly empty space with particles popping in and out of existence. It feels like time flows at a constant rate, but relativity shows that time is flexible, stretching and compressing depending on velocity and gravity. Visual illusions provide simpler examples of how experience can mislead. Two lines of the same length can appear different based on surrounding context. Colors can seem to shift depending on adjacent colors. Motion can be perceived where there is none, or missed where it exists. Your brain is constantly constructing your visual experience from limited information, filling in gaps, making assumptions, and sometimes those constructions don't match objective reality. Memory is another domain where we know our experience can be unreliable. You remember an event from your past with complete confidence, convinced you're recalling exactly what happened. But research shows that memories are reconstructed each time we access them, and they can be altered without our awareness. False memories can be implanted through suggestion. Details can shift over time. The story you remember might bear only a loose relationship to what actually occurred, even though the experience of remembering feels vivid and certain. So the mere fact that free will feels real, feels undeniable, doesn't necessarily mean it is real. Our intuitions, however compelling, might be pointing us in the wrong direction. The feeling of control might be something the brain generates, a useful fiction that helps us navigate the world, even if it doesn't correspond to any genuine metaphysical freedom. Why would the brain generate such a fiction? One possibility is that the sense of agency serves important functional purposes. It might help with learning and motivation. If you experience yourself as an agent who makes choices and whose choices matter, you're more likely to put in effort, to persist in the face of difficulty, to take responsibility for outcomes. The feeling of control, even if illusory, might be adaptive, helping individuals navigate complex social and physical environments more effectively. The sense of agency might also be crucial for social coordination. When we attribute agency to ourselves and others, when we see people as making choices and being responsible for those choices, we can engage in the kind of moral and social interactions that hold communities together. We can negotiate, make agreements, hold each other accountable, and coordinate behavior through shared expectations about choice and responsibility. If everyone operated from the assumption that choices are illusory, these social structures might break down. And this is where the scientific investigation of free will becomes both fascinating and unsettling. Because when we actually look inside the brain, when we measure what's happening in the moments before we experience a decision, we find something that seems to challenge the common sense view of choice in a profound way. The very tools that revealed our intuitions about the sun and the stars to be backwards, that showed its solid matter to be mostly empty space, that demonstrated time to be relative rather than absolute, these same tools now turn inward, examining the neural basis of the felt experience of choosing, and what they find is both illuminating and deeply puzzling. Benjamin Libet's revolutionary experiments. In the early 1980s, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet conducted a series of experiments that would send shockwaves through philosophy, neuroscience, and popular culture. His research seemed to demonstrate something that contradicted our deepest intuitions about choice and consciousness. What he found suggested that our brains might be making decisions before we're consciously aware of making them, that the feeling of deciding might be an after-the-fact construction, a story consciousness tells itself about a process that's already been set in motion beneath the surface of awareness. Libet wasn't the first to study the neural correlates of voluntary action. That distinction belongs to German researchers in the 1960s who discovered something called the readiness potential using electroencephalography. They found that when people performed voluntary movements, there was a characteristic pattern of brain activity that preceded the movement. It showed up as a slowly building negative electrical charge, starting small and gradually increasing until the movement occurred. This finding was interesting, but it wasn't particularly controversial. Of course, the brain shows preparation activity before a voluntary movement. That's just neuroscience working as expected. The movement doesn't just appear from nowhere. The motor systems need to prepare. Muscles need to be coordinated. The action needs to be planned. Seeing neural activity before a movement is like seeing a sprinter crouch into position before the starting gun. It's preparation, not a challenge to free will. But Libet added a crucial element that transformed the significance of these findings. He didn't just measure when the readiness potential appeared relative to the movement. He also measured when participants became consciously aware of their intention to move. And that's where things got philosophically interesting. Libet's experimental setup was elegantly simple, though the execution required considerable technical sophistication. He asked participants to sit in front of a special clock, a spot of light that rotated around a circle like a second hand but much faster, completing a full rotation in about 2.56 seconds. The participants were given a straightforward instruction. Whenever you feel like it, flex your wrist or press a button. There was no right time to do it, no external prompt, no reason to choose one moment over another. Just wait until you spontaneously feel the urge to move, and then move. And when you do, remember where the spot on the clock was at the moment you first became aware of your intention to move. This last part was critical, and also quite difficult. Participants had to introspect carefully, noting the precise moment when they first felt the conscious urge to move, and then report after the movement was complete where the clock spot had been at that precise moment. This required a kind of temporal introspection that most people aren't accustomed to. We're not usually paying attention to the exact timing of our conscious experiences relative to an external clock. Meanwhile, Libet was monitoring the participants' brains using electroencephalography, or EEG. Electrodes placed on the scalp pick up the collective electrical activity of large populations of neurons firing beneath. When many neurons fire in synchrony, The combined electrical signal is strong enough to detect at the surface of the head. This technology had been around since the 1920s and was well established for studying brain activity, though it has limitations. It has good temporal resolution, measuring changes on the scale of milliseconds, but poor spatial resolution. You know something is happening in the brain, but you can't pinpoint exactly where with great precision. Libet also measured the exact moment when the muscle actually moved, using electromyography, or EMG. This involved placing electrodes on the arm to detect the electrical signals that trigger muscle contraction. So he had 3 key measurements: when the readiness potential began, when participants reported becoming consciously aware of the intention to move, and when the actual movement occurred. What Libet discovered was startling. The readiness potential began, on average, about 550 milliseconds before the actual movement. That's more than half a second. But here's the crucial finding. When participants reported the moment they first became consciously aware of their intention to move, that conscious awareness came about 200 milliseconds before the movement, or roughly 350 milliseconds after the readiness potential had already begun. In other words, the brain activity associated with preparing to move started about a third of a second before the person consciously experienced deciding to move. The numbers varied somewhat between participants and across 2 trials, but the pattern was consistent. Neural preparation preceded conscious awareness of intention. Think about what that means for a moment. According to these results, your brain has already initiated the process of moving before you're aware of having decided to move. The conscious experience of choosing comes later, appearing after the neural machinery has already started working toward a particular action. It's as if consciousness is a narrator who arrives on the scene after the story has already begun, describing as a choice what was actually a foregone conclusion. The implications seemed profound and deeply unsettling. If the brain decides before we consciously decide, who is really in control? The experimental results suggested a picture where unconscious neural processes are the real drivers of behavior, and conscious awareness is just along for the ride, generating the feeling of having chosen after the fact. We think we're deciding to move, but actually, the decision has already been made beneath the surface of awareness. Consciousness experiences the outcome and mistakenly attributes it to deliberate choice. Imagine a government where the real decisions are made behind closed doors by unelected officials. But then a spokesperson holds a press conference taking credit for the decisions and claiming they resulted from careful deliberation. The spokesperson genuinely believes they made the decisions, but they're mistaken. The real power lies elsewhere, hidden from view. Libet's experiments seem to suggest that consciousness is like that spokesperson, taking credit for decisions it didn't actually make. Libet himself was somewhat cautious in his interpretation, more careful than many who later cited his work. He didn't claim to have disproved free will entirely. In fact, he suggested that consciousness might still play a role through what he called the veto power. Even though the unconscious brain might initiate actions, he proposed that consciousness could still cancel them in the brief window of roughly 100 to 200 milliseconds between becoming aware of the intention and the actual movement. You might not be free to start the process of deciding, but you might be free to stop it. This veto idea is interesting. It suggests a picture where unconscious processes continuously generate action impulses, and consciousness acts as a kind of quality control filter, allowing some to proceed while vetoing others. It's like having an eager assistant who keeps making suggestions for what to do next. And your job as conscious awareness is to approve or reject those suggestions. You're not initiating action, but you're exercising a kind of control through selective approval. But this veto power, even if it exists, seems like a diminished form of free will compared to what we intuitively believe we have. It makes consciousness more reactive than proactive, more an editor than an author. And some researchers even questioned whether the veto itself might be initiated unconsciously before becoming conscious, which would push the problem back another level. Yet despite Libet's own caution, many scientists, philosophers, and writers seized on his findings as a definitive proof that free will is an illusion. The experiments became iconic, cited again and again in debates about consciousness, agency, and moral responsibility. Book titles announced the illusion of conscious will, or declared that free will is an illusion. Popular science articles spread the message that neuroscience had finally settled a centuries-old philosophical debate. The brain decides, not you. The sense of choosing is a trick, a convincing story your brain tells itself about what was actually a mechanical process. These interpretations spread far beyond academic journals. The findings entered the cultural conversation, shaping how people thought about responsibility, identity, and human nature. They influenced debates in law, ethics, and public policy. If people don't really have free will, if their actions are determined by unconscious brain processes they can't control, what does that mean for criminal justice, for moral education, for how we think about praise and blame? Some researchers even started investigating whether learning about Libet's experiments changed people's behavior. They found that when people read articles arguing that free will is an illusion based on neuroscientific findings, they subsequently showed reduced self-control and increased willingness to cheat or behave unethically. Simply being exposed to the message that free will doesn't exist seemed to undermine motivation and moral behavior, at least in the short term. This raised troubling questions about the social consequences of scientific findings. Even if Libet's interpretation was correct, was it wise to widely publicize it? The experiments also sparked intense philosophical debate. Some philosophers argued that the findings vindicated determinism and showed that folk psychology, our everyday way of thinking about minds and choices, was fundamentally mistaken. Others pushed back, questioning either the interpretation of the results or the relevance of simple finger movements to genuine moral decision-making. The philosopher Patricia Churchland argued that the experiments showed something interesting about the timing of neural processes, but didn't actually threaten free will as philosophers understood it. The relevant question isn't whether neural processes precede conscious awareness. Of course they do. That's how brains work. The question is whether our actions are determined by our own psychology, our own reasons and values, as opposed to being coerced or resulting from factors alien to our character. Libet's experiments don't address that question at all. Other philosophers, like Daniel Wegner, embraced the implications more fully. Wegner argued that conscious will is indeed an illusion, a feeling that the mind generates to create a sense of authorship, but which doesn't correspond to genuine causal control. In his view, We're like observers watching a movie and mistakenly believing we're directing it. But even as Liebig's findings captured imaginations and sparked fierce debates, something important was happening in the scientific community. Researchers were taking a closer look at the experiments, at the methodology, at the assumptions underlying the interpretations. And as they did, cracks began to appear in what had seemed like a decisive case against free will. The story, as it turned out, was considerably more complicated than the popular narrative suggested. The neuroscience deepens. In the decades following Leibig's original work, neuroscience technology advanced dramatically. Researchers gained access to much more sophisticated tools for peering inside the working brain. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, allowed scientists to see which regions of the brain were active during different tasks, tracking blood flow and metabolic activity with impressive spatial resolution. Single-cell recording techniques, where electrodes are placed directly in the brain, could monitor individual neurons firing in real time. With these powerful new tools, researchers set out to explore the neural basis of decision-making in greater depth. One particularly influential study, published in 2008 by a team led by neuroscientist John Dylan Haynes, pushed the findings even further than Liebig had. Using fMRI, the researchers asked participants to make a simple choice. Press a button with their left hand or their right hand whenever they felt like it. But instead of just measuring when the readiness potential appeared, the team used pattern recognition algorithms to analyze the brain activity and predict which choice the participant would make. The results were striking. The researchers could predict, with about 60% accuracy, which hand the participant would use up to 10 seconds before the participant reported being consciously aware of their decision. 10 seconds. That's an eternity in terms of neural processing. It suggested that information about an upcoming choice was present in brain activity long before consciousness caught wind of what was about to happen. These findings seemed to push the implications of Liebig's work even further. It wasn't just that consciousness appeared slightly after neural preparation for movement. It was that the brain appeared to already be leaning toward a particular choice many seconds before conscious awareness kicked in, the sense that you're deliberating, weighing options in real time, might be a complete fabrication, with the actual decision already taking shape in patterns of neural activity you have no access to. But here's where things get more complex. That 60% accuracy is important. It's better than the 50% you'd get from random chance, which means there is information in the brain about the upcoming choice. But it's far from perfect prediction. That suggests the outcome isn't completely determined by the early brain activity. There's still variance, still uncertainty in the system. The early neural patterns might be biasing the outcome, pushing the system in one direction, but not fully determining it. Moreover, the task itself was artificial in important ways. Participants were asked to make a completely arbitrary choice with no consequences, no reasoning, no meaning. Press left or right whenever you feel like it, for no reason at all. This is very different from the kinds of meaningful decisions we care about in real life. When you're deciding whether to take a new job, or how to respond to a friend who hurt you, or what values you want to organize your life around, you're not making arbitrary choices. You're engaging in deliberation, considering reasons, weighing evidence, thinking about consequences. Neuroscientists studying more complex forms of decision-making have found something interesting. When people engage in genuine deliberation, when they're thinking through options that actually matter, different patterns of brain activity emerge. Networks involved in memory, emotion, reasoning, and planning all activate and interact in intricate ways. The simple picture of an unconscious readiness potential determining the outcome doesn't capture what's happening in these richer decision-making processes. There's also the question of what exactly the readiness potential represents. In Libet's original interpretation, it was seen as the brain committing to a specific action, as the decision being made unconsciously. But subsequent research has suggested a different possibility. Maybe the readiness potential doesn't represent a decision at all. Maybe it represents something more like the brain entering a state of readiness, preparing for action without yet committing to a specific choice. Maybe it's just background noise in neural activity, random fluctuations that sometimes cross a threshold and trigger a movement, especially in tasks where the timing is arbitrary and there's no real reason to choose one moment over another. This alternative interpretation has gained significant traction in recent years. Researchers like Aaron Scherger have proposed that in tasks where people are asked to act spontaneously whenever they feel like it, what's really happening is that neural noise is accumulating until it reaches a threshold. When you look backwards in time from the moment of action, you see this gradual buildup, and it looks like preparation for a specific decision. But it might just be randomness slowly drifting toward a boundary. Think of it like this. Imagine you're watching leaves floating on a stream, and you're asked to pick up a specific leaf when you feel like it. There's no reason to pick one moment over another, so you're basically waiting for some internal signal to tell you now. That signal might be nothing more than random fluctuations in your neural activity hitting a threshold. When we measure backwards from your action, we see the buildup of that random drift, and it looks like your brain was preparing to act. But there wasn't really a decision being made unconsciously. There was just noise accumulating until something happened. If this interpretation is correct, it changes everything. It means Libet's experiments weren't actually measuring unconscious decisions at all. They were measuring something much more mundane, the random neural activity that leads to arbitrary spontaneous actions. And that tells us very little about real choice, about deliberation, about the kind of decision-making that we actually care about when we ask whether we have free will. Determinism and the clockwork universe. To really understand what's at stake in the free will debate, we need to step back from neuroscience for a moment and look at the bigger picture of how the universe works. Because the challenge to free will doesn't come only from studies of brain activity. It comes from a more fundamental feature of physical reality itself: causation. Every event in the physical world seems to be caused by prior events. The ball moves because you kicked it. The water boils because heat was applied. The flower grows because of sunlight, water, and nutrients in the soil. This principle of causation is so fundamental, so ubiquitous, that it forms the basis of all scientific investigation. We look for causes. We trace effects back to their origins. We build explanations by showing how one thing leads to another. Classical physics, particularly as developed by Isaac Newton in the 16th century, presented a vision of the universe as an enormous mechanism, a clockwork system where every current state was perfectly determined by the previous state, plus the laws of nature. If you knew the position and velocity of every particle in the universe at one moment, and if you knew all the laws governing how those particles interact, you could in principle calculate the exact state of the universe at any future time. The future would be perfectly determined by the present, which was determined by the past, all the way back to the initial conditions at the beginning of everything. This idea, sometimes called Laplacian determinism, after the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace, who articulated it clearly, is both elegant and terrifying. It suggests that everything that has ever happened or will ever happen was already implicit in the initial state of the universe billions of years ago. Every star that forms, every planet that coalesces, every living creature that emerges through evolution, every thought you've ever had, every choice you believe you've made. All of it was already determined from the first moment, an inevitable unfolding of physical law acting on matter and energy. Imagine a simulation of the universe running on a cosmic computer. You enter the initial conditions, the positions and velocities of every particle at the moment of the Big Bang, along with the fundamental laws of physics. Then you press play and watch it unfold. Galaxies form, stars ignite, planets cool, life emerges, consciousness arises, civilizations develop. Every single event, down to the most minute detail, was determined by that initial state and those laws. You could pause the simulation at any point, examine any individual particle or person, and trace its current state back through a perfect chain of causes to the beginning of time. In this deterministic picture, there's no room for genuine choice in the way we intuitively understand it. Your brain is made of atoms. Those atoms obey physical laws. Their current configuration was determined by their previous configuration, which was determined by the configuration before that, and so on, back through your entire life, back through your birth, back through your parents' meeting, back through evolutionary history, back through the formation of the solar system, back to the Big Bang. Every thought you think, every decision you believe you're making is just atoms moving according to the laws of physics. You couldn't have thought differently or decided differently because the atoms in your brain couldn't have moved differently. They were always going to arrange themselves exactly the way they did, given the prior state of the universe and the laws governing matter and energy. Let's make this concrete with an example. You're deciding whether to have coffee or tea this morning. You feel like you're weighing the options, considering your mood, thinking about which sounds more appealing. Eventually, you choose coffee. But in a deterministic universe, that choice was inevitable from the moment the atoms that now make up your brain began their journey billions of years ago. The particular arrangement of neural connections, neurotransmitter levels, hormones, memories, and countless other factors that led to coffee being selected was itself the inevitable result of prior states. The atoms of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and other elements that make up your neurons were forged in ancient stars. Those stars formed from clouds of gas that coalesced under gravity according to physical law. The gas came from the Big Bang, distributed in a particular pattern that determined where galaxies would form, where stars would ignite, which planets would harbor life. Every step of that vast cosmic process was determined. And at the end of that long chain of causation, you chose coffee, but only in the sense that water chooses to flow downhill. It's not really a choice. It's just physics. This is often called causal determinism, and once you really absorb the implications, it's deeply unsettling. It means that the choice you believe you're making right now about whether to keep listening or to let your mind wander, that was determined billions of years ago. The particles that make up your brain were always going to be arranged exactly this way at exactly this moment, producing exactly this mental state, leading to exactly this action. Consider a more emotionally charged example. Someone commits a terrible crime, hurting innocent people. Our natural reaction is moral outrage. They chose to do something horrible. They're responsible. They deserve punishment. But if determinism is true, that person couldn't have acted differently. Their genetics, their childhood experiences, their brain chemistry, the specific sequence of events that led to the crime, all of it was the inevitable result of prior causes stretching back before they were born. They're no more responsible for their actions than a rock is responsible for rolling down a hill when pushed. This challenges not just our sense of free will, but our entire framework of moral responsibility, justice, praise, blame, pride, regret, and all the reactive emotions that presuppose people could have done otherwise. If determinism is true, these responses start to seem like category errors, like being angry at rain for ruining your picnic or proud of a tree for growing tall. In this view, the history of the universe is like a movie that's already been filmed. We're just watching it play out, frame by frame, with no ability to change anything because everything has already been determined by what came before. You feel like you're making choices, but that feeling itself is just another predetermined state of your atoms, a necessary consequence of the causal chain that stretches back to the beginning of time. The philosopher Schopenhauer captured this sentiment with his famous phrase, "Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." You can act according to your desires, but you can't choose which desires you have. Those desires arise from causes beyond your control, shaped by genetics, upbringing, circumstances, and the specific configuration of your brain at any moment. You're free to act on your will, but your will itself is determined. Now, it's worth noting that modern physics has complicated this picture somewhat. Quantum mechanics introduces a kind of fundamental randomness at the smallest scales of reality. When you measure a quantum particle, its properties don't have definite values until the measurement is made. Before that, they exist in a superposition of possibilities, and which particular outcome you get when you measure appears to be genuinely random, not determined by prior states. Some people have suggested that quantum randomness might provide a loophole for free will, a source of indeterminacy that breaks the deterministic chain. Maybe, they argue, the brain somehow exploits quantum effects, and the randomness at the quantum level gets amplified up to the level of neural processing, introducing genuine openness in our choices. But here's the problem with that idea, which philosophers have been quick to point out. Randomness isn't really what we mean by free will either. If your choices are random, If they're just the result of quantum dice rolls in your brain, then you're not in control any more than you would be in a deterministic universe. A choice determined by chance is not a free choice. It's just luck, arbitrary, uncontrolled. Free will seems to require something beyond both determinism and randomness. It seems to require that you, as a conscious agent, can genuinely influence outcomes in a way that isn't fully determined by prior causes and isn't just random chance. It needs to be a third option, neither fully determined nor purely random, something that reflects your genuine agency, your real authorship of actions. But what could that third option even be? How could an event be neither determined by prior causes nor random? This is sometimes called the problem of agent causation. We want the agent, the person, the self, to be the source of the action in a way that gives them ultimate control. But if the agent's choice isn't determined by anything, including the agent's own character, beliefs, and desires, then how is it really the agent's choice? And if it is determined by the agent's character, beliefs, and desires, then we need to ask what determined those, and we're back in the causal chain. This is the deep problem at the heart of the free will debate. Determinism seems to rule out genuine choice because everything is already determined. But randomness doesn't help either because random choices aren't your choices, they're just luck. What we want is something that's both not determined by prior causes and not random, something that's influenced by our conscious deliberation and reflects our genuine agency. And it's very hard to see what that something could be, or how it could exist in the physical universe we actually inhabit. So, when neuroscientists like Libet measure brain activity preceding conscious awareness, they're not inventing the challenge to free will. They're providing empirical detail to a philosophical problem that was already there. If your brain is a physical system, and physical systems are determined by prior states, then your brain states right now were determined by your brain states a moment ago, which were determined by the moment before that, and so on. The feeling of making a choice is just another determined brain state in that causal chain. This is why the free will debate matters so much. It's not just about some technical question in neuroscience or philosophy. It's about whether the fundamental structure of reality allows for the kind of agency we feel we have, the kind of control we believe we exercise over our lives. It's about whether moral responsibility makes sense, whether the self is real or illusory, whether consciousness matters or is just an epiphenomenal side effect of physical processes. These are questions that cut to the core of what it means to be human in a physical universe governed by law and causation. The compatibilist response. Faced with the challenge of determinism, many philosophers have responded with a position called compatibilism. This view, which is actually the majority position among philosophers who study free will, argues that free will and determinism are not in conflict at all. They're compatible. You can have both. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a cop-out, like philosophers are trying to have it both ways by redefining free will until it fits with determinism. But actually, compatibilism involves a sophisticated rethinking of what we should mean by freedom and choice. And it's worth taking seriously because it addresses some real problems with the incompatibilist view, the view that says determinism and free will can't coexist. The key move compatibilists make is to shift the focus from whether you could have done otherwise to whether you acted according to your own will, your own desires, your own reasoning. Freedom, in this view, isn't about being free from the causal chain of events. It's about acting from internal motivation rather than external coercion. Consider the difference between these two scenarios. In the first, someone holds a gun to your head and forces you to hand over your wallet. In the second, you freely decide to donate money to a charity. In both cases, determinism might be true. In both cases, the atoms in your brain are following physical laws, and your actions are the inevitable result of prior causes. But there's still an important difference between these situations that matters for how we evaluate them morally and how we experience them subjectively. In the first case, you're coerced. Your action doesn't reflect your own will. You wouldn't have handed over your wallet if not for the external threat. In the second case, you're acting freely. The action reflects your own values, your own choices. It comes from you, from your internal motivations and deliberations, even if those motivations and deliberations are themselves part of the deterministic causal chain. Compatibilists argue that this difference is what we should mean by freedom. Free will isn't about being uncaused or being able to violate the laws of physics. It's about acting in accordance with your own psychology, your own reasons, your own character. When you're thinking through a difficult decision, considering different options, weighing pros and cons, and then choosing based on what matters most to you, that's a free choice, even if the entire process was determined. This view has some attractive features. It preserves moral responsibility because we can still distinguish between actions that reflect someone's character and values versus actions that are coerced or result from mental illness or manipulation. It makes sense of why we spend so much time deliberating about important decisions. Even if the outcome is determined, the process of deliberation is part of what determines it. Your reasoning matters because it's one of the causes in the causal chain. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has defended compatibilism by arguing that the kind of freedom that's compatible with determinism is the only kind of freedom that could possibly matter or even make sense. He suggests that the incompatibilist conception of free will, the idea of a choice that is not determined by anything, is actually incoherent. A choice that has no causes, that doesn't flow from your beliefs or desires or values, wouldn't be your choice at all. It would be random, arbitrary, disconnected from who you are. From this perspective, the right question isn't, could I have done otherwise, holding everything about the past and the laws of nature constant? Because that's an impossible counterfactual that doesn't match how agency actually works. The right question is, did this action flow from my deliberation, my character, my values? If yes, then it was a free action, regardless of whether it was determined. Compatibilists also point out that we already implicitly make compatibilist judgments all the time. When someone commits a crime, we try to determine whether they were of sound mind, whether they understood what they were doing, whether they were coerced or manipulated. These questions matter because they help us to figure out whether the action really came from the person's own will. We don't ask whether determinism is true. We ask whether the person's own psychology was the relevant cause of the action. But compatibilism has its critics. Many philosophers, called incompatibilists, argue that compatibilists are changing the subject, redefining free will in a way that doesn't address the real problem. They say that what we really care about, what we really mean when we talk about free will, is the ability to have done otherwise, the sense that our choices aren't predetermined. And no amount of redefining can give us that if determinism is true. The incompatibilist might say, sure, there's a difference between acting from your own will and being coerced. But if determinism is true, your will itself was determined by factors beyond your control. You didn't choose your genes. You didn't choose your early childhood experiences. You didn't choose the culture you grew up in or the brain you were born with. All of those things shaped who you are, shaped your desires and values and patterns of thought. So even when you act according to your own will, you're still not ultimately in control because you didn't choose the will you have. This leads to an argument about what philosophers call ultimate responsibility, or sourcehood. Some incompatibilists argue that for true moral responsibility, you need to be the ultimate source of your actions, and that requires that the chain of causes leading to your choice traces back ultimately to you, not to factors beyond your control. But in a deterministic universe, the chain of causes always traces back beyond you, back through your history, back through evolution, back to the Big Bang. These debates get intricate very quickly, with philosophers developing sophisticated arguments on both sides. But the core tension is this. Compatibilists think free will should be defined in terms of acting from your own deliberation and values, which is compatible with determinism. Incompatibilists think free will requires something more, some kind of ultimate control or ability to have done otherwise that determinism rules out. Interestingly, surveys show that most professional philosophers accept compatibilism. But that doesn't settle the question, because there's still vigorous debate about which version of compatibilism is correct, and whether any version truly captures what we care about when we talk about free will. Recent challenges to the no free will interpretation. Over the past decade or so, something interesting has happened in neuroscience. The field has begun to reconsider the interpretation of Libet's experiments and similar studies. New research has raised serious questions about whether these experiments really show what many people thought they showed. And in some cases, former no free will proponents have revised their positions, acknowledging that the neuroscientific evidence is much weaker and more ambiguous than it initially appeared. One of the most important critiques focuses on how we interpret the readiness potential. As I mentioned earlier, researchers like Aaron Scherger have proposed that in tasks involving arbitrary spontaneous movements, the readiness potential might not represent a decision at all. It might just be random neural noise that happens to cross a threshold. When you're asked to press the button whenever you feel like it, with no reason to choose one moment over another, your brain is essentially in a waiting state. Random fluctuations in neural activity drift up and down, and when they happen to cross a certain threshold, you feel an urge to move, and you act. If you look backwards in time from the action, you'll see these fluctuations building up, and it looks like preparation or a decision. But that's an illusion created by the backwards perspective. It's like watching a drunk person stumble around and eventually fall over, and then concluding that they must have been planning to fall in that exact spot, because their meandering path led there. The readiness potential might not be a decision signal at all, just noise that eventually triggers a response. This interpretation has been supported by computational modeling and new experiments. When researchers simulate decision-making systems with random noise, they can reproduce the readiness potential pattern without any actual decision happening beforehand. And when they design experiments that better control for these issues, the apparent prediction of choice from early brain activity becomes much weaker or disappears entirely. Another problem with the Libet-style experiments is the method of measuring when conscious awareness occurs. Participants have to remember where a clock hand was at the moment they first felt the urge to move, and they report this after the movement is complete. But memory is notoriously unreliable, especially for such precise timing. Studies have shown that people are not very good at accurately pinpointing the exact moment of conscious intention, and their reports can be influenced by various factors. Some researchers have developed alternative methods for measuring the timing of conscious awareness, using techniques like probe-caught methodology, where random interruptions ask people to report on their current mental state. These studies suggest that conscious intention might actually occur earlier than the Libet experiments indicated, potentially even before the readiness potential begins in some cases. There's also the fundamental question of what these experiments can tell us about real-world decision-making. The tasks are so artificial, so stripped of meaning and context, that it's questionable whether they capture anything important about how we make actual choices. When you're deliberating about whether to move across the country for a new job, you are engaging in a complex process involving memory, emotion, reasoning about consequences, consideration of values, and much more. This is nothing like deciding on a whim to flex your wrist with no reason at all. Neuroscientists studying more ecological forms of decision-making, decisions that actually matter to people and involve real deliberation, have found different patterns. Brain activity associated with genuine choice involves widespread networks, dynamic interactions between regions, and processes that unfold over much longer timescales than the simple readiness potential before a spontaneous finger movement. In 2019, a meta-analysis looked at all the Libet-style studies that had been conducted over the years. Meta-analyses are powerful because they combine data from multiple studies to look for overall patterns and assess how reliable findings are. This particular meta-analysis found that while there does seem to be some pattern where the readiness potential precedes conscious intention, the effect is much more uncertain and variable than often claimed. The quality and consistency of the evidence is weaker than many people realized. Importantly, several neuroscientists who had previously argued that free will was an illusion based on this research have now acknowledged these problems. They have recognized that the interpretation was too hasty, that the evidence doesn't actually support the strong claims that were made. Some have published papers explicitly walking back the free will is an illusion conclusion and arguing for more nuanced interpretations. This doesn't mean neuroscience has proven free will exists. Far from it. What it means is that the neuroscientific challenge to free will, at least as based on the Libet experiments and similar work, is not as strong as many people believed. The brain science doesn't definitively rule out a role for conscious deliberation in decision-making. It doesn't prove that consciousness is just a passive observer with no causal influence. The situation is much more complex and uncertain than either. The simple neuroscience proves free will is an illusion narrative, or the simple we obviously have free will because we feel it narrative. We're in a place of genuine scientific uncertainty, where the tools of neuroscience have given us new windows into the brain but haven't yet resolved the deepest questions about the nature of choice and consciousness. The role of consciousness. One of the most persistent confusions in the free will debate involves a misunderstanding about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. When people learn that brain activity precedes conscious awareness of a decision, they sometimes conclude, "Aha, my brain decided, not me." But this phrasing reveals a strange implicit dualism, as if I am something separate from my brain. Here's the thing. You are your brain. Or, more precisely, you are the processes happening in your brain and nervous system, along with how those processes interact with your body and environment. There's no little person sitting inside your head, distinct from the neural machinery, watching decisions happen and mistakenly thinking they're in control. The neural machinery is you. When your brain makes a decision, you're making a decision. This point has been emphasized by several neuroscientists and philosophers. When we say unconscious brain processes are generating decisions before conscious awareness, we're not saying that something alien to you is controlling you. We're saying that the full you is much larger than just conscious awareness. Most of what your brain does happens beneath the surface of consciousness. Your visual system is processing shapes, colors, and movements constantly. Your motor system is coordinating thousands of muscle movements when you walk. Your memory systems are retrieving information, consolidating experiences, and associating ideas. Almost all of this happens unconsciously. Consciousness seems to be more like a spotlight that can illuminate certain parts of cognitive processing, or like a narrative thread that ties together selected moments of experience into a coherent story. It's not the whole of you, and it's probably not where most decisions originate. But that doesn't make it powerless or illusory. It's a real aspect of how your brain works, with real causal effects on your behavior. Think about learning to drive a car. At first, every action requires conscious attention. You think about pressing the clutch, shifting gears, checking mirrors, staying in your lane. It's exhausting, but gradually these actions become automatic. Your unconscious processes take over most of the work. You can drive while having a conversation or thinking about something else entirely. Does this mean you're not in control of the car? Of course not. The unconscious processes that are doing the driving are still you. They're just a different layer of you than conscious deliberation. Some philosophers and neuroscientists have argued that consciousness might play a particularly important role in certain kinds of decisions. When you're facing a novel situation, a difficult choice, or a conflict between competing desires, conscious deliberation becomes more important. This is when you need to step back, consider options explicitly, reason through consequences, and make a thoughtful choice rather than just acting on habit or instinct. In these cases, consciousness might function like an executive control system that can modulate and override more automatic processes. You might have an immediate impulse to lash out in anger at someone who offended you, but conscious deliberation allows you to pause, consider the consequences, think about your values, and choose a different response. This is the kind of thing Libet was pointing to with his idea of the veto power, the ability of consciousness to inhibit an action that's already been initiated. Recent research has explored this idea of conscious control more carefully. Studies have looked at situations where people have to inhibit a prepotent response, where there's a conflict between an automatic tendency and a more thoughtful choice. The neuroscience of these situations is complex, but it does seem like conscious awareness and deliberation play a meaningful role in the outcome, not just as passive observers, but as active participants in determining what happens. There's also the question of how consciousness relates to learning and flexibility. Conscious processing might be particularly important for learning new skills, adapting to novel situations, and changing ingrained patterns of behavior. When you're consciously working on a problem or deliberately practicing a new habit, you're using cognitive resources in a different way than when you're acting automatically. And this conscious engagement can reshape your unconscious processes over time. So, while it's true that much of what drives behavior happens unconsciously, and while conscious awareness often comes later than the initiation of neural processes, that doesn't mean consciousness is epiphenomenal, just along for the ride with no influence on anything. Consciousness is part of how your brain works, part of the causal structure that produces behavior. The relationship is complex, with conscious and unconscious processes interacting in intricate ways, but both are genuinely part of the causal story. Understanding this helps dissolve some of the confusion around the free will question. The issue isn't whether your brain or you are in control. It's about what kind of causal structure underlies choice, what role deliberation and consciousness play in that structure, and whether the concept of free will, properly understood, can fit with the neuroscientific picture of how brains work. Meaningful versus meaningless choices. Here's something crucial that often gets overlooked in discussions of free will. Not all choices are created equal. The experiments that seem to challenge free will almost always involve trivial, arbitrary, meaningless decisions. Press a button with your left hand or your right hand. Flex your wrist whenever you feel like it. Choose any random moment to act with no reason for that timing. These are radically different from the kinds of choices that matter in our actual lives. When you decide whether to go back to school, whether to end a relationship, whether to forgive someone who hurt you, whether to pursue a creative passion, or stick with a stable career, you're not making arbitrary, spontaneous movements. You're engaging in deliberation. You're thinking about reasons, weighing evidence, considering consequences, consulting your values, imagining different futures. This deliberative process takes time. It might unfold over days, weeks, or even months. It involves consciously considering argument bends for and against different options. It incorporates memories of past experiences, emotions about what matters to you, logical reasoning about likely outcomes, and often discussions with other people whose perspectives you value. This is a completely different cognitive process from press the button whenever you feel like it for no reason. When neuroscientists study more realistic decision-making, the picture becomes much more complex. Brain imaging studies of people making meaningful choices show activation across distributed networks involving memory systems, emotional processing regions, areas associated with reasoning and planning, and systems that simulate possible futures. These networks interact dynamically, with information flowing back and forth as the person thinks through the problem. In these situations, conscious deliberation seems to play a genuine role. When you consciously think about an argument for one option, that activates relevant memories and associations that then feed into the decision-making process. When you imagine yourself making one choice versus another, you are engaging systems that predict outcomes and evaluate them emotionally. The conscious thoughts aren't just epiphenomenal descriptions of something already decided, they're part of the process that leads to the decision. Moreover, with meaningful choices, there's often genuine uncertainty, even within the deterministic framework. Your brain state at the beginning of deliberation doesn't rigidly determine the outcome because the deliberation itself changes your brain state. As you think through reasons, retrieve memories, and consider perspectives, you are modifying the neural landscape. The process is more like exploring a space of possibilities than following a predetermined script. There's also a difference between proximal decisions, what to do right now in this immediate moment, and distal decisions, what path to take over a longer time frame, what kind of person to become. The neuroscience of free will has focused almost entirely on proximal decisions, and usually very trivial ones. But most of what we care about regarding free will involves distal decisions and the ability to shape our own character and life trajectory over time. Can you choose to become more patient? Can you decide to develop a new skill that changes your opportunities? Can you work on becoming more honest or more courageous? These questions involve something more like self-authorship than simple moment-to-moment choice. They're about whether you can deliberately shape who you are, whether through conscious effort you can change patterns that would otherwise persist. There's some evidence that you can. People who engage in deliberate practice, who consciously work on changing their behavior, often succeed in reshaping their automatic responses over time. Someone with an anger problem can learn to notice the feeling rising, pause, and respond differently. Someone with a phobia can gradually retrain their emotional responses through systematic exposure. These processes involve conscious intention and effort, and they produce real changes in brain structure and function. This suggests a picture where conscious deliberation might not control every momentary action, but it can shape the trajectory of development, influencing what kind of a person you become and therefore what kinds of actions will flow naturally from you in the future. You're not just passively experiencing predetermined choices. You're actively involved in constructing the self that will make future choices. So, when evaluating claims about whether neuroscience disproves free will, we need to ask, which kind of choice are we talking about? If it's arbitrary, meaningless, spontaneous actions in a laboratory setting, the neuroscience might show something interesting about those specific cases. But we shouldn't automatically assume that tells us everything about deliberative choice, about character development, about the kinds of agency that matter most in human life: moral responsibility and society. The question of free will isn't just an abstract philosophical puzzle or a technical problem in neuroscience. It has profound practical implications for how we organize society, how we respond to wrongdoing, and how we think about human potential and responsibility. Our entire criminal justice system, at least in principle, is built on assumptions about moral responsibility. When someone commits a crime, we hold them accountable. We impose punishment or require rehabilitation. The justification for this, beyond simple pragmatic deterrence, usually involves the idea that people are responsible for their actions, that they could have chosen differently, that they deserve punishment for wrongdoing. If free will is an illusion, if people's actions are simply the inevitable result of their genes, their upbringing, their brain chemistry, and the circumstances they find themselves in, then this framework starts to seem unjust. How can you punish someone for something they had no ultimate control over? It would be like punishing someone for having brown eyes or being short, treating as a moral failure what is actually just a product of factors beyond the person's control. Some philosophers and scientists who deny free will have argued for exactly this conclusion. They suggest we should move beyond retributive justice, beyond the idea that people deserve punishment for wrongdoing, and instead focus entirely on consequentialist approaches. What matters is protecting society, rehabilitating offenders if possible, and deterring future crime, not assigning moral blame based on a false notion of free will. This approach has some appeal. Our current justice systems often seem to focus too much on punishment and too little on understanding the causes of criminal behavior or addressing them effectively. If we recognized that criminal actions are the product of deterministic causes, we might invest more in prevention, in addressing poverty and inequality, in mental health treatment, in creating social conditions that reduce crime rather than just punishing it after the fact. But the shift away from moral responsibility raises difficult questions. If a person commits a horrible crime, if they murder someone or abuse a child, our immediate moral intuition is that they deserve punishment, that justice requires holding them accountable. This intuition runs very deep. It's hard to imagine completely abandoning the idea that some actions deserve moral condemnation and some people deserve blame. Moreover, the concepts of praise and blame, pride and shame, gratitude and resentment. These reactive emotions seem central to human social life. They're part of how we signal what we value, how we coordinate behavior, how we maintain relationships and communities. If we tried to eliminate all moral judgment based on the recognition that free will is an illusion, we might be trying to eliminate something fundamental to human nature. Others worry that the message that free will is an illusion might be dangerous, that it could change behavior in harmful ways. If people come to believe they're not really in control of their actions, if they absorb the idea that choices are predetermined, might this undermine motivation, responsibility, and ethical behavior? Several studies have investigated this question, and the results are concerning. When people read articles arguing that free will is an illusion, they subsequently show reduced self-control and increased willingness to cheat or behave unethically in laboratory tasks. The belief in free will, whether or not it's metaphysically true, seems to function as a kind of motivational scaffold that encourages responsible behavior. One study had participants read either a passage from a neuroscience article claiming that free will is an illusion, or a neutral passage as a control. Then they completed a task where they could cheat without being detected. The group that read about free will being an illusion cheated significantly more. In another study, exposure to anti-free will messages reduced helping behavior and increased aggression. The effects weren't huge, and they occurred in artificial laboratory settings, but they were statistically significant and worrying. These findings suggest that belief in free will has important social functions. It supports self-control, moral behavior, and taking responsibility for one's actions. Even if free will is metaphysically problematic, the belief in it might be pragmatically valuable. This creates a genuine dilemma for those who conclude that free will is an illusion based on scientific evidence. There's a genuine dilemma here. On one hand, we don't want to base our social institutions and moral practices on false beliefs. If free will really is an illusion, we should face that truth and figure out how to structure society accordingly. We shouldn't perpetuate comforting myths just because abandoning them is difficult or has costs. That seems intellectually dishonest. On the other hand, if belief in free will has important practical benefits, even if it's false, maybe we should be cautious about widely propagating the message that it's an illusion, at least until we have better alternatives in place. Maybe some beliefs are useful fictions that society needs to function well. Or maybe we need to find ways to preserve the practical benefits of moral responsibility while giving up on the metaphysical assumption of libertarian free will. But this dilemma might be based on a false dichotomy. The compatibilist approach offers a middle path. If free will, properly understood, is compatible with determinism, then learning that our actions are determined by prior causes doesn't require giving up on responsibility. We can maintain that people are responsible for actions that flow from their character and values, that punishment and praise make sense as ways of influencing behavior and expressing moral judgments, while also acknowledging the full causal story of how people become who they are. This compatibilist framework might even lead to a more humane and effective justice system. Instead of focusing primarily on whether someone freely chose to commit a crime in some metaphysical sense, we can focus on understanding the full causal picture. What factors led to this behavior? How can we prevent it in the future? How can we help this person develop better patterns of action? How do we balance individual accountability with recognition of the environmental and biological factors that shape behavior? We could maintain criminal justice while reconceiving its purpose and methods. Punishment might be justified not because people ultimately deserve it, but because it serves important social functions, deterring future crime, incapacitating dangerous individuals, expressing societal condemnation of harmful acts, and potentially rehabilitating offenders. These justifications don't depend on libertarian free will. They depend on the practical effects of sanctions and the importance of maintaining social order and protecting the vulnerable. There's also the question of how beliefs about free will affect personal experience and well-being. Some research suggests that people who believe in free will are more likely to take responsibility for their lives, to work toward goals, to feel agency and autonomy. Believing you can change, that your efforts matter, that you're not just a passive victim of circumstance, seems to be psychologically beneficial even if we're uncertain about the metaphysical status of free will. People who feel they have control over their lives, who believe their choices matter, tend to be happier, more resilient, and more successful in achieving their goals. This sense of agency might be supported by belief in some form of free will. If you think your choices are predetermined and meaningless, you might be less motivated to make the effort to improve your life or pursue your goals. At the same time, a recognition of determinism or heavy causal influences on behavior can increase compassion and reduce harsh judgment. If you understand that people's actions flow from factors often beyond their control, from difficult childhoods, from mental illness, from poverty and limited opportunities, from brain chemistry and genetic predispositions, you might be more inclined toward empathy and support rather than condemnation. You can hold someone accountable for their actions while also recognizing the humanity and the causal story behind those actions. This more compassionate approach might lead to better outcomes in many contexts. In education, understanding that students' struggles often reflect the factors beyond their control can lead to more effective support rather than just blame. In parenting, recognizing the limits of children's self-control can lead to more patient and effective guidance. In the workplace, understanding the causes of poor performance can lead to better interventions than simply punishing or firing people. The practical upshot might be that we need a nuanced view that recognizes both the causal factors shaping behavior and the value of treating people as agents who can respond to reasons, who can learn and change, who are appropriate targets of moral emotions like praise and blame within limits. We need criminal justice reform that takes seriously both the need for accountability and the recognition that people's choices are heavily influenced by factors beyond their control. Perhaps what we should aim for is what some philosophers call a stance of optimistic skepticism about free will. Remain open to the possibility that we don't have ultimate metaphysical freedom while still treating ourselves and others as responsible agents in practical contexts. Hold moral intuitions lightly while still acting on them. Recognize the causal influences on behavior while still working to develop character and make better choices. The mystery remains. As we near the end of this journey through the question of free will, I want to be honest with you. We don't have a definitive answer. Despite centuries of philosophical debate and decades of neuroscientific investigation, the question remains deeply puzzling. The more we learn, the more complex and nuanced the picture becomes, but a complete resolution remains elusive. What we do know is that the simple picture of free will, where a non-physical soul makes uncaused choices that then influence the body, doesn't fit with our scientific understanding of the world. We also know that the simple claim that neuroscience proves free will is an illusion is too hasty, based on misinterpretations of experiments that don't actually establish what they're often said to establish. The reality is more interesting and more subtle than either extreme. Consciousness does seem to play a genuine role in decision-making, particularly for complex, novel, or conflicting choices. But much of what drives the behavior happens beneath conscious awareness, and conscious experience often lags behind the initiation of neural processes. We're not fully in control in the way naive intuition might suggest, but we're also not just passive observers of predetermined events. The question of whether this picture is compatible with meaningful free will depends partly on how you define free will. If you define it as requiring the ability to have done otherwise with everything about the past and the laws of nature held constant, then probably not. Physical systems evolve deterministically or randomly, and neither seems to leave room for that kind of alternative possibilities. But if you define free will in terms of acting according to your own deliberation, values and reasoning without being coerced or manipulated, then there seems to be room for it even in a deterministic world. The compatibilist framework offers a way to preserve what matters about free will, responsibility, and agency while accepting the scientific picture of causation. There are still deep puzzles, though. How does consciousness relate to neural processing? How can we be the ultimate source of our actions if we didn't choose our genes, our early environment, or the initial structure of our brains? How can we make sense of the feeling of genuine openness when facing a choice, the phenomenology of deliberation, if the outcome is determined? These questions push up against the limits of current understanding. They involve issues in philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and the nature of causation that remain actively debated. It's possible that future advances in neuroscience, philosophy, or even physics will shed new light on them. It's also possible that some aspects of these questions will remain permanently mysterious, touching on features of subjective experience that resist full scientific explanation. What I find remarkable is that we can even investigate these questions at all, that we can use the tools of science to study the very processes that make science possible, that consciousness can examine itself. The brain trying to understand how the brain makes choices is a beautiful recursion, a strange loop where the investigator and the investigated are the same thing viewed from different perspectives. And there's something valuable in simply engaging with the question, even without reaching a final answer. Thinking carefully about free will encourages humility about human behavior. It reveals the complexity of decision-making, the interplay of conscious and unconscious processes, the ways environmental and biological factors shape who we are. This understanding can make us more thoughtful about moral judgments, more compassionate toward human weakness, more aware of how choice and deliberation actually work. It also raises our appreciation for the strangeness and wonder of conscious experience. That you can deliberate about whether to keep listening, that you can think about thinking about choice, that you have this inner life where possibilities present themselves and decisions crystallize into action. These are extraordinary phenomena regardless of their ultimate metaphysical status. Conclusion and reflection. So here we are at the end of this exploration, and perhaps you feel more confused than when we started. That's okay. That might even be appropriate. Some questions don't have tidy answers, and the question of free will is certainly one of them. What we can say is that the truth is more nuanced than the popular narratives suggest. The story that neuroscience definitively proved free will is an illusion, that's too simple, based on a misunderstanding of the evidence. The story that we obviously have free will because we feel it directly, also too simple, ignoring the genuine puzzles about consciousness, causation, and the relationship between deliberation and determination. The reality involves layers of complexity. Yes, unconscious processes in your brain play a huge role in generating behavior, often before conscious awareness kicks in. Yes, your choices are heavily influenced by factors you didn't choose, from genes to childhood experiences to current circumstances. Yes, the universe likely operates according to deterministic or random physical laws, with no obvious room for the kind of ultimate control that naive free will requires. But also, conscious deliberation is real, and causally relevant, not an illusion or epiphenomenon. The difference between acting from your own reasoning versus being coerced or manipulated matters profoundly. You can influence your own character development over time through conscious effort. The experience of agency, of being a self that navigates the world and makes choices, corresponds to genuine features of how human cognition works. Perhaps the most important lesson is that we should be careful about letting theoretical conclusions about free will change how we treat ourselves and others in unhelpful ways. Whether or not we have ultimate metaphysical free will, we're still creatures who respond to reasons, who can learn and change, who benefit from being treated as agents rather than mere objects. We're still appropriate targets of praise and blame, of encouragement and accountability, of moral emotions that presuppose some form of responsibility. And on a personal level, the question of free will invites you to examine your own experience more carefully. Notice what it feels like when you make a choice. Pay attention to the interplay of conscious deliberation and unconscious intuition. Observe how your character and habits shape what choices present themselves to you, and which options feel compelling. Recognize both the constraints on your agency and the real power you have to shape your life trajectory through sustained effort and intention. The question also connects to larger themes about consciousness, selfhood, and what it means to be human in a physical universe. We're matter that has become aware of itself. Atoms arranged in such a way that they can contemplate atoms, physical processes that have developed the capacity to ask whether they're genuinely free. That's extraordinary, regardless of how we ultimately answer the free will question. As you let these ideas settle, as you prepare to drift into sleep or return to your day, I invite you to hold the question lightly. You don't need to solve it tonight. You don't need certainty about whether you have free will in some ultimate sense. What you can do is notice your experience, act thoughtfully when choices arise, take responsibility for what you do, while also being compassionate toward yourself and others about the factors that shape behavior. If you found value in this exploration, I hope you'll consider liking this video or subscribing to Sleepy Answers. Your support helps keep these deep dives into profound questions going, creating a space where curiosity and wonder can unfold without rush. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of philosophy's most enduring mysteries. For now, let yourself rest. Let go of the need to figure everything out. You've spent time with a question that humans have wrestled with for millennia, and that's enough. Your mind has done its work. Now, it's time to soften, to settle, to release the grip of analysis, and float in the quiet space of not knowing. The question of free will still be there tomorrow, as it has been for all of human history. But right now, in this moment, you can simply be. Breathing, existing, aware. Whether determined or free, whether conscious control or elegant illusion, this moment of awareness is real. This moment of rest is yours. Good night.